Experts still cannot explain these thousand-year-old mysteries, from strange metallic spheres found deep in the earth to an ancient city suggesting advanced civilization. This is a compilation of some of the most baffling ancient mysteries going back thousands of years. You won't want to miss this one. On a sweltering January morning in 2015, a 45-year-old archaeologist named Johnny was on a remote hillside in Palpa, Peru, squinting up at the barren slope above him. He'd been out here for 3 days now, hiking these desolate hills with nothing but a backpack, some water, and a folder containing a single grainy black and white photo from the 1970s. But right now, trudging up this particular hillside for what felt like the 100th time, he was starting to wonder if he'd finally lost his mind. As he ascended higher, he noticed something, that there were these arrangements of stones that were scattered across the hillside that seemed deliberate. They didn't form any clear patterns, and he thought that these were probably just old agricultural terraces or maybe natural erosion patterns. Because people had been living here for thousands of years, there would naturally be some human modification of the landscape. But the more he continued climbing, the more he would encounter these strange stone arrangements. And the weird thing was, they were covering a massive area. We're talking about like 60 to 70 meters across this entire hillside. And this was when he decided to talk to some of the local residents who lived in the valley below. When he actually described what he was looking for, showing them the old photograph, they just shook their heads because they didn't know what he was talking about. Even though they had lived there their whole lives, their family had been there for generations, nobody had ever seen anything unusual on this particular hillside. Completely stumped, Jonathan really had to sit back and think, whatever was in that 1960s photo must be gone now, destroyed by erosion or development or who knows what else. So the following day, he went back up the hillside, and this time he tried to actually map out what he was seeing. And he'd walk along one line of stones, marking it in his notebook, and then he would move to another section. And as he did this, he began to notice that these arrangements were actually taking shape in a way that looked human-like. On one, there was what appeared to be an arm extending from a larger mass of stones, and at the end of that arm, there were these circular arrangements that looked disturbingly like a head. He was thinking that this couldn't be right, that he was probably just seeing patterns that weren't really there, the way people see faces in clouds. But the more time he spent, the more convinced he became that these weren't simply random patterns. And at the end of what he thought might be an arm, there was this distinct arrangement of stones that looked exactly like a human head, which means it appeared as if the figure was holding a severed head. This made Johnny, or Jonathan, genuinely unsettled. The ancient cultures of this region, particularly the Paracas people who lived here thousands of years ago, practiced ritual head-taking. But surely this couldn't be a representation of that, right? Feeling he needed a different perspective, he climbed to a higher point on an adjacent hill, somewhere he could look back at the slope that he had been investigating, and when he turned around and looked back, his heart nearly stopped, because from this vantage point, with the afternoon sun hitting it just right at the right angle, he could see it clear as day. All those seemingly random stone arrangements weren't random. They formed the outline of a massive figure, well over 65 meters long, and it wasn't human. This was a mythological creature, a deity from the ancient Paracas religion. It had a human arm extending from its body, and yes, it was holding a severed human head. There were more heads depicted inside its body and what appeared to be a fish near its mouth. This was the mythical killer whale, one of the most important supernatural beings in this ancient religious pantheon. But the geoglyph was so weathered, so faint after years of erosion that from ground level, it was essentially invisible. I mean, you could walk right over it and never know. That 1960s photograph he had with him was of this lost geoglyph. And in fact, what he had discovered would turn out to be one of the oldest in all of Peru, created what they estimate around 200 BC by the Paracas culture. And this even predated the famous Nazca lines by several centuries. This means that the Paracas had used two different techniques to create this. Some parts were made by scraping away the dark surface stones to reveal lighter soil, creating these outline trenches, but the other parts, including the eye of the whale, were made by actually piling up stones to create raised features. What's interesting is the reason that German researchers had lost track of it in the 1960s was because they had recorded the wrong coordinates. They were off by enough that future researchers were looking in the wrong area entirely. And because the geoglyph was on a slope rather than flat ground like the famous Nazca lines, it had suffered much more erosion from rainfall and just gravity over time. In 2017, a team of 6 specialists from Peru's Ministry of Culture would join John to carefully clean and restore the geoglyph. They removed centuries of debris, outlined the stones more clearly, and stabilized the area against erosion. The killer whale geoglyph was formally recorded with precise GPS coordinates, ensuring it would never be lost again. Today, it's part of a protected circuit of ancient geoglyphs in Palpa, and it's considered one of the most important archaeological discoveries in Peru in recent decades. The archaeologist who discovered this had been studying the ancient cultures of Peru for over 25 years, and since 1989, he'd been co-directing a major archaeological project in the region. His name was Johnny Ayla Cuadrado. Quick pause before we continue, because this is one of the few things that's actually made my weeknights easier. I love cooking real food at home. I just hate planning meals and grocery shopping. But that's where HelloFresh completely changed things for me. Everything shows up at my door, pre-portioned, no thinking involved. I pick from over 100 recipes each week, and most of them take about 30 minutes or less, which is honestly faster than waiting for takeout. They've got high protein options, comfort food, lighter meals, and I could skip weeks or swap meals anytime. No pressure, no commitment. Tell me, what's better than that? So if you want to eat better without living in a grocery store, this is the easiest way I've found to do it. Right now, you can get a free Zwilling 4-star chef's knife on your third box, a $144.99 value, plus 10 free meals, and your first box ships free with my code LURKSHFZWL. Make sure to use my code to get this deal before supplies run out. You can scan the QR code on screen or use the link in the description. In the early 1980s, a team of American researchers arrived at the edge of the Sahara Desert in Algeria. Up ahead was nothing but rolling sand dunes stretching as far as the eye could see, and the team had hired local guides from the nearby town of Timimun to take them deep into the Tout Desert region. What they were looking for wasn't much more than a rumor. Somewhere out there, supposedly an ancient fortress, and no one knew who built it or why. Now, even though they'd been paid good money, the guides that the researchers hired hesitated to take them any further. This is one of the harshest environments on the planet. But the Americans insisted, and they headed out into the Sahara. And soon, the determination paid off, because as they crested this massive sand dune, one of the guides pointed ahead and shouted something in Arabic. And sure enough, there, rising up from the sand about 32 feet high, was their destination, the Qasar Draw, also known as the Timimun Fortress. Now, even from the distance, researchers could tell that this structure was different from anything else they'd studied in the region. Most fortified villages like this were built in mountainous areas for defense, and they were all pretty much the same. They all had attached houses clustered together along with mosques, baths, ovens, and shops. But this fortress was pretty different. For starters, it was completely circular, nearly 200 feet in diameter, and it was out here in the middle of nowhere all by itself. Now, I should mention that this team wasn't the first to have visited Qasar Draw, but nothing they'd heard could have prepared them for how this place actually looked, because as they got closer, they began noticing these little details that did not add up. The walls of the place were double layered, with a clay wall on the inside and a wall of stones covering the clay on the outside. The weird thing, though, was there weren't any windows facing outward. Not a single one. And you'd think that you'd want to see outside your fortress, right? But there wasn't any way to do that. The only original opening was the single entrance on the northern side. So, as they get to the entrance, the hand of the team turns to one of their guides and asks him to remind him when this thing was built. And the guide just shrugs and says that nobody knows for sure. 30 generations or something like that, which means it must have been built somewhere around the 1300s. But again, that's all guesswork because the true history of the structure had been lost over time. That was when the head of the team finally let the cat out of the bag. He made a very unusual request, and he asked the guides to leave him and his team there for an entire week. Now, when they heard this, the guides were obviously very shocked. They just tried to tell him how dangerous it was to be out here all alone. But the team lead assured the guide that they'd be fine. I mean, after all, they had the supplies, they had the equipment, and everything they needed. The guides eventually left, and they agreed to return in 1 week's time. Now, right away, researchers got to work. They headed through that single entrance and found themselves in this ancient courtyard. And it was easier to see how this place was constructed. I mean, looking up, they could see that all the rooms had been built across 3 different levels between 2 walls. But the thing that nobody figured out was exactly how people were supposed to get up there. It wasn't just that the access points had fallen into ruins. There wasn't any way to get up there, and it looked like there never had been. There weren't any visible staircases connecting the levels. There weren't any stairs or ramps either. It just didn't make sense. This was just the start of their investigations though, because as they explored further, they discovered something even weirder. Now, as it turned out, none of the rooms connected to each other. Each section was completely isolated. And if you were in one room, you couldn't get to another room without going all the way back out into the courtyard. That doesn't seem very safe for a place that's supposed to be a fortress, does it? It's like whoever built this place deliberately wanted to keep people separated. Well, that first night, the team starts kicking around theories. And one of them suggests that maybe Qasar Dra wasn't a fortress at all. Maybe this was a sort of way station, a desert inn where travelers could stop along trade routes. Known commonly as caravanserais, were pretty common in this part of the Sahara. A long time ago, they were used to control the movement of caravans and collect taxes from travelers. Some even had libraries. The only problem, though, is if the Qasar Dra was a caravanserai, none of its architecture matched the other ones that archaeologists had excavated. So, after hitting this dead end, one of the other researchers speaks up and suggests that maybe this place was a military outpost. But again, even that doesn't check all the boxes. None of this is making sense. Who builds a fortress without windows for defense? And then there's the whole issue of the rooms and being isolated. So then they think, hey, isolated rooms, this must be a prison, right? Well, as the days passed, the team continued their investigation, and their theories continued. The best they could figure was that removable ladders must have been used to access the different levels. That might explain the lack of stairs, but it still didn't tell them why Qasar Dra had been built in the first place. But then, on their 4th day there, one of the researchers made a discovery that changed everything. You see, on one of the interior walls, hidden by centuries of dust and sand, they found a series of partially eroded symbols. One of them looked like a 6-pointed star. Others looked a little bit more recognizable. They seemed to be ancient Jewish symbols. Now, this discovery opened up a whole new line of thinking. The team knew that Jews had lived in the area since the 1st century, when they'd fled persecution from the Roman Emperor Trajan. And according to historical documents from the 1440s, the Jewish community had been involved in trans-Saharan trade here at this location. Well, eventually, conflict broke out between this community and the locals, resulting in bloodshed around 1492. So, folks, could this fortress have been a refuge for the Jewish community, a place where they sought shelter? Whether or not Qasar Dra served as a hideout didn't really matter, because it didn't tell them who built this place to begin with. And so soon enough, the end of the week came, and the guides returned just like they said they would, and they asked if the researchers had learned anything. The team, of course, just rambled and argued, and all the guides could do was just nod because they knew all along that the Qasar Dra wasn't going to ever give up its secrets too easily. Nowadays, Qasar Dra still sits in the middle of the Sahara. It remains one of the best preserved forts in the region, but also one of the most mysterious, because no one, not the locals nor the archaeological community, has a good idea of how it came to be there or what it was really used for. And in another 700 years, it will probably still be there waiting for someone to finally unlock its secrets. In the summer of 1966, an archaeologist named Jack D. Eaton was trudging through the dense jungle of southeastern Mexico. He was in the state of Campeche on the Yucatan Peninsula, and he was there as a part of this big joint study between National Geographic and a university. They were planning to do this major archaeological excavation of an ancient Mayan city called Bacon. But before they could start digging, they needed Jack to survey the area to make sure they weren't missing anything important. And so for days, he had been hacking his way through the thick vegetation with this small team, and they would map out the terrain and taking all the notes they needed, basically doing all the unglamorous groundwork that comes before any of these big digs. It was hot, it was humid, and Jack wasn't expecting to find much. His job was just to make sure there wasn't anything else in the immediate vicinity that they should know about. But on this morning, him and his team were about 1.25 miles west of the city when they noticed the ground beneath their feet was starting to rise, and they were walking up what seemed to be a natural elevation like a small hill. And as any archaeologist will tell you, when you're in ancient Mayan territory and you find a hill, you pay attention. Because the Maya, they like to build on high ground. It gave them strategic advantages, better drainage, all sorts of practical benefits. So Jack and his team start climbing, pushing through the undergrowth, and after maybe about 20 minutes, they reach what seems to be the top. Initially, it looks to be just more jungle, but one of his assistants calls out and points to something that's partially hidden by vines and just centuries of plant growth. It's a solid stone structure. And not just a pile of rocks, but clearly something that was built by hands. And so Jack is getting excited, his heart's racing. This is exactly the kind of thing they're trained to look for. And as they begin very carefully clearing away some of the vegetation, there isn't just one. There are multiple, and they're all constructed in a very specific architectural style that he immediately recognizes. It's called Rio Bec, and it's the same style at Bacon and other classic period Mayan sites in this region. And so over the next several hours, Jack and his team work to get a better sense of what they've found. It becomes clear that this is an entire settlement, a small Mayan city that's been swallowed up by the jungle and forgotten. The buildings are all in various states of decay, but they're substantial structures made of carefully cut limestone. And out of all these structures, something grabs his attention, and it's located in the eastern section of what appears to be a small square or plaza. As he approaches it, clearing away more of the vegetation, he realizes he's looking at an entrance, a doorway into a structure. The entire portal has been carved and shaped to look like something very specific, and as more of it is revealed, he can hardly believe it. The doorway is designed to look like the open mouth of an enormous serpent. Now, to understand why this was such a big deal, you have to know a little bit about Mayan culture. Serpents were hugely important in their mythology. They represented the connection between earth and the sky, between the physical world and the spiritual one. And one serpent deity in particular, Itzamna, was considered one of the most powerful in their pantheon. But what Jack is looking at isn't just a symbolic representation. The ancient Maya who built this, probably around 700 BC, based on the construction techniques, they had gone to great lengths to make this doorway look as realistic as possible. The lintel above the door and the threshold below are carved to look like rows of teeth, and on either side of the entrance, spiral designs represent its eyes. And the entire facade of the building curves and undulates to suggest the serpent's body. But here's what really got to him as he stood there looking. To enter, you literally had to walk into the mouth of the serpent. You had to pass between its teeth, under its eyes. And for ancient Maya who used this structure, the act of entering would have been deeply symbolic. It would have been like being swallowed by the deity, passing from the ordinary world into the sacred space within. So Jack spends the rest of the day documenting the structure, which he designates as Structure 2 in his notes. He realizes that this wasn't some minor outpost. This was a thriving settlement that existed during the classic period of Mayan civilization. And based on some of the other buildings he's seen, like the Serpent, for example, was built even earlier. Jack would later determine that this city once reached its peak power of influence around 300 AD, making it one of the earliest major settlements in the entire region, and it would have housed thousands of people. And for some reason, around the year 1100, the city was abandoned. People left, and the jungle began its slow work of reclamation. What's interesting is this city was only about 2 kilometers or just over a mile from Pecan. The two cities would have been inhabited at the same time. They even shared the same architectural style. They probably traded with each other, maybe even fought with each other. Jack was given the honor of naming this establishment. And even today, you yourself can go here and visit this site. The ancient city that Jack discovered is known as Chicana, or Mouth of the Serpent. Early one spring morning in 1989, 2 archaeology grad students from Chelyabinsk State University named Sasha and Peter found themselves at an exciting new dig site in a remote corner of Russia. They'd gotten up early before the sun had even come up, and the idea was that they were going to impress their professors with a few extra field hours, maybe even earn a little extra credit. Everything went well at first. Sasha had just finished setting out all their equipment when she heard Peter yelling out to her. There was something that he wanted her to see on the other side of this ridge. Well, as soon as Sasha finished up what she was doing, she headed in the direction of her classmate's voice. And sure enough, he found something very interesting, because just up ahead, Peter was standing at the edge of the survey grid near the ruins of this low stone wall. Nothing grand, just a ring of rocks half buried in the dirt. When Sasha got to where he was, Peter started wandering into the center. Now, Sasha knew they weren't supposed to be doing this, but honestly, she was curious too, and couldn't pass up the chance for a little unsupervised exploration. I mean, what could be the harm in it, right? So Sasha stepped into the circle with her friend, and she had just barely made it into the center of the stone circle when she noticed something very odd. Somehow, the air seemed thicker here, and when she looked around, she realized this pale mist had started rising up from the ground. And in just a few seconds, it was so thick that Sasha could barely see her own feet. And that's when she realized something. It wasn't just her feet that she was having trouble seeing, it was everything. Even though the circle was fairly small, Sasha couldn't see the edges anymore. And even stranger, she couldn't see Peter either, even though he must have only been a few feet away. But she could still hear him. But now he sounded like he was way across the valley. So she started to call out to him, and that was when she saw the flash. It didn't make any sound, and she didn't feel any heat, but it definitely happened. In fact, it was so bright that Sasha automatically closed her eyes when it went off. But it only lasted a second. Maybe Peter had taken a photograph, but she didn't remember him bringing a camera. And if he'd taken a picture, then he should have been close enough for her to see him. But instead, she was standing completely alone. And then she heard the voices. They started as these subtle whispers, but over the course of just a few seconds, the overlapping voices grew louder and louder, like somebody was standing right beside her. She couldn't make out the words, but it felt like an entire crowd of people had surrounded her. It was almost too much for Sasha to bear, but just as the panic began to set in, everything changed. Everything went silent. The mist dissipated as quickly as it had appeared, and there in front of her was Peter, coming from the opposite end of the stone circle. Obviously, she was very relieved, and they were both very confused, and so the two of them, without saying a word, just headed back towards where the rest of the team was camped. It was a bad idea to have headed out here alone, and now they knew why. As it turned out, the rest of the team had not seen or heard a thing. Later, when Sasha and Peter tried to compare notes, they found that their memories were disjointed, like they were only remembering fragments. Neither of them could explain the mist, the flash, or the disembodied voices. All they knew was that they'd walked into a simple stone ring in broad daylight and walked out with a story that still didn't make any sense. As alarming as this experience was, Sasha and Peter were not the first students to ever visit this place. In fact, it had been discovered 2 years earlier by students from the same university. On the morning of June 20th, 1987, 2 university students named Alexander Voronov and Alexander Ezreal were heading across a barren field in Russia's southern Ural region. They were part of a survey team sent to investigate this area to see if it had any real archaeological value. Now, this was a time-sensitive job because within a year, this whole valley would be completely flooded by a new reservoir. Both had been on site for hours looking for something worth preserving. It was tedious work, and they were basically just walking back and forth across empty fields, occasionally photographing a rock formation or, marking down the location of an old fence post. There's nothing exciting going on. Nothing that would make it into any history books. However, as they crested this very small hill, Mr. Voronov stopped dead in his tracks, and he was staring down at the ground in front of him. Now, initially, his friend thought maybe he'd spotted an artifact. But when the other Alex reached the top of the hill, he realized it wasn't an object that had caught his classmates' attention. It was the shape of the land itself. Below them were these strange embankments. They were different than the rest of the area, and they clearly were not natural. They were too clean and geometric, and with a little imagination, it almost looked like there were massive walls that might have stood here a long time ago. Only now, thousands of years later, they'd been covered by dirt and grass until only the faintest outline could be seen. This was the first exciting thing all day, so the students immediately contacted their supervisor, an archaeologist from the Chelyabinsk State University named Gennady Zdanovich. And when he got there, Gennady knew that this was significant because he had seen things like this before. There were obviously the remains of some sort of ancient structure, but that wasn't the only thing that Gennady realized. He also knew that the clock was ticking because they had less than a year before this entire area would be underwater, so they had to act quickly. Now, over the next several months, Gennady and his team began carefully excavating the site, and folks, what they found was absolutely mind-blowing, because this wasn't some simple ancient settlement. This was far more important than that. This was a massive fortified city, and it had been built with a level of sophistication that seemed utterly impossible for its age. They named it Arkaim, after a nearby mountain. The outer structure that Alex had found was massive. Arkaim was perfectly circular, with thick walls arranged in concentric rings, and it stretched over 520 feet in diameter. Now, the walls themselves were 16 feet thick and about as tall, with a 6.5 foot deep moat surrounding the whole thing. And once they started digging, they learned that these walls had been carefully engineered, made from adobe with timber frames, all covered in unfired clay bricks. Now, inside these walls, archaeologists found the remains of about 60 dwellings, all very carefully arranged. The houses in the outer ring faced inward toward a circular street, while the houses in the inner ring faced a central square. Like the outer walls, these buildings were highly sophisticated. Each house averaged around 1,600 square feet of floor space over multiple rooms, and everyone had its own well, storage cellar, hearth, and this is crazy, each building even had its own furnace for smelting bronze and making pottery. Now, I want you guys to understand that if you're not familiar with ancient archaeology, this was unheard of for a place this old. But it wasn't just the houses themselves that amazed everybody who worked on this, because everything about how Arkaim is laid out is extraordinary. It shows levels of urban planning that this part of the world was not supposed to have for another millennia. The city itself had a wooden paved circular street with a covered drainage system underneath it. There were even gutters that collected rainwater and channeled it into storage pits. and the artifacts themselves showed clearly that the inhabitants of Arkaim were way more advanced, a lot more than their neighbors. And in fact, archaeologists found the world's oldest known chariot at a nearby site dating to around 2026 BC. But the most incredible discovery was that this city had been designed as a massive astronomical observatory. From above, the entire layout creates a pattern that looks like ancient sacred symbols. And the four main gates are precisely aligned with the cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west. But it goes beyond that because the doors of the houses, the gates, even the angles of the walls, everything is precisely aligned with the movements of the sun, the moon, and the stars. Now today, we know that whoever lived there could have used their city to track at least 18 different astronomical events. And these alignments, they aren't just approximate, folks. Arkaim's observations are accurate to within 1 arc minute. To put that in perspective, that's 10 times more precise than the famous alignments at Stonehenge. So the question is, how old is Arkaim exactly? Based on the artifacts found there, archaeologists have determined that Arkaim was built around 2050 BC. That makes it nearly 4,000 years old. It's part of something called the Sintashta culture, which is an ancient civilization that once flourished in the Eurasian steppes during the Bronze Age. And based on burials found nearby, they appeared to be an Indo-Iranian people who ritually sacrificed horses as part of their religion. According to archaeologists, Arkaim once housed somewhere between 1,500 to 2,500 people, and at its height, it must have been a sight to see. I mean, there's tons of evidence of highly advanced farming, metalworking, and pottery making. 4,000 years ago, this was like Manhattan. But here's where things get really strange, because after thriving for about 200 years, the entire city was practically abandoned overnight, and we don't know why. Now, it's clear that it wasn't because of war, disease, famine, natural disasters, or anything like that. But for whatever reason, archaeologists can tell that the inhabitants deliberately set fire to their city before leaving. I mean, they burned it all. Every house, every community structure, the whole thing. Then they just walked away and they never came back. Now you're probably asking the same questions as me. Why would an entire civilization deliberately destroy their own city, especially one this advanced? And the simple fact is, nobody knows. For whatever reason, by 1989, Arkaim was facing destruction again, because as news of the discovery spread, the Soviet government faced a dilemma. The reservoir project was already underway, they had already spent millions, and the dam was nearly complete. And in less than 6 months, Arkaim would be underwater forever. So, Gennady and his team launched a desperate campaign to save the site. They petitioned government officials, they wrote letters to newspapers, and they tried their hardest to convince anyone who would listen that Arkaim was too important to lose. And miraculously, their campaign worked, because in April of 1991, just weeks before the valley was scheduled to be flooded, the Council of Ministers canceled the reservoir project and declared Arkaim a protected historical site. And it's a good thing too, because archaeologists were about to make another shocking discovery. They soon learned that Arkaim was not unique, that it was actually part of an entire series of settlements. In using aerial photography and satellite imagery, they found more than 20 similar circular cities spread across the southern Urals and northern Kazakhstan, all built with the exact same distinctive architecture. And, are you ready for the kicker? They were all abandoned around the same time. But no matter how much they learned, archaeologists still had the same questions. Was it really just a city or something stranger? Now, some researchers began to wonder if Arkaim might have been a spiritual center. I mean, the possibility was reinforced when archaeologists made a disturbing discovery in 2013. While excavating a nearby site in the Arkaim Valley, they found some human remains, and the skulls of these skeletons were very odd. You see, They'd been deliberately deformed, pressed and bound from infancy into these unnaturally stretched shapes. This practice is commonly known as cranial deformation, and you actually see it a lot with elite members of ancient societies who wanted to distinguish themselves from the commoners. But even though we know it was something that our ancestors practiced in different parts of the world, that doesn't really make it any less strange. I mean, we all know what an elongated skull looks like. As word about these discoveries spread around, Arkaim began to attract attention from people interested in more than just archaeology. Everything about it enticed people who were looking for evidence of ancient mysteries like extraterrestrial visitation. On top of ancient alien researchers, people interested in mythology also started to come up with their own theories about Arkaim. Some said it was the birthplace of Zoroaster, the ancient prophet who founded Zoroastrianism. Others suggested it might be connected to the legendary city of Asgard from Norse mythology. And the surrounding mountains have their own mysteries as well, from miraculous healings to divine revelations, to groves of trees that supposedly only grow in spirals. Whatever is going on at Arkaim, the Russian government eventually designated it as an official national and spiritual shrine. And folks, not long after, people from various religious movements started making pilgrimages there. And that's when the reports started coming in. Visitors left and right to this place began experiencing things they simply could not explain. They said that they were seeing strange lights in the sky above the ruins, and UFO sightings became very common. Others claimed to hear voices speaking in unknown languages when they walked around the ancient walls. Some reported feeling suddenly disoriented, and even a few claimed to see ghostly figures moving through the ruins at night. But seriously, those things were reported. Now, it isn't just tourists to Arkaim who have noticed that the whole place is strange, because scientists have even noted that the area around Arkaim has very unusual and strange magnetic properties. I mean, compasses don't work properly, electrical devices seem to malfunction. And some researchers think that these anomalies might explain all the strange experiences that people are having, but it might not be the cause of all this supernatural activity. It might just be another symptom. Nowadays, Arkaim remains one of the most mysterious archaeological sites in the entire world. People continue to study it. They try to understand how a Bronze Age civilization could have possessed such advanced knowledge. But folks, the more we learn, the less we seem to know. And all we can say that for certain is that 4,000 years ago, some sophisticated civilization built a city the world had never seen. They lived there for 2 centuries, watching the stars, and one day, for some reason, they set the city ablaze and walked away, leaving behind only ruins and questions. In August of 1942, a forest ranger named H.K. Madwell was leading a small expedition through the treacherous terrain of the Himalayan mountains in northern India. Despite the extremely dangerous conditions of this region and the fact that he's 16,500 feet up, Madwell was very familiar with it because he had worked here for years. He had trudged up and down these slopes a lot, so he was very comfortable leading this group. Despite it being in August, because of their elevation, it had been snowing a lot recently. The dense snow significantly slowed the process, and the icy conditions made the experience worse. They were traveling between the towering peaks of Trishul and Nanda Gunti when they set up camp for the night. Because they were so close to their destination, Madwell spent extra time that evening ensuring that all their food was rationed and they had enough supplies to make the return trip back. And he was just so excited that night that he actually had problems sleeping. In addition to, the freezing cold, brutal temperatures, because that also played a role. By early the next day, the expedition had broken down their camp and continued onward toward their destination. Now, despite it being August, and it's only the 2 months of the year where the snow and ice temporarily melt away, there was still enough on the ground that made the journey difficult. I mean, this expedition was planned this time for not just this reason, but also because where they were headed wouldn't be frozen at all, or so they hoped. The last major challenge the expedition had to make it through was to reach the top of a ridge deep in the mountains. And it took them a little while, but once they all reached the top, they could just barely make out the small oval of water sitting at the bottom of a rocky basin below. Madwell was completely overjoyed, as was his expedition, because this was great news. Their destination was right there in front of them. So everybody began to descend down into the rocky basin below, and in a way, their excitement kept them from noticing what was out of place, at least until they got a little bit closer. And as they began to close in the distance between them and this lake, all of them thought they were seeing these strange looking rocks or some kind of debris that they had never seen before. That whatever this was had to have been uncovered by the melting snow. But there was something really wrong about these rocks, because they didn't look like typical rocks that you'd find along the shore of any lake. Many of them were either too long or simply too narrow, but they weren't all that large. Strangely, they were all this pristine white, as if they had just been bleached by the sun. And once the team drew close enough, they realized what they were looking at. Scattered around the edges of this lake and partially submerged in the water were hundreds of human bones. They didn't look very old, and many of them were not fully decomposed. In fact, several of the skeletons still had flesh attached. The expedition realized for the first time in that moment that they were looking at the scene of a massacre. There were human remains literally everywhere, and by this point, everybody in the group was in a frenzy, and many of them were second-guessing this expedition altogether. Between the terror and confusion, because remember, this is in a very remote and sacred region of the Himalayas, so to stumble upon what appeared to be hundreds of dead bodies isn't just disturbing, it felt like they're cursed, and that they may very well fall victim to the same fate that all these people did. Not exactly sure what they should do next, the porters, who helped carry the luggage for the expedition, all turned as a group and ran back up the basin and out of view. They flat out refused to stay another moment in this place of death for fear that they were next. Madwell was just as terrified and confused, but because of his career as a forest ranger, he felt driven by his duty and integrity, regardless of how horrible or strange the situation was. Madwell and his assistant made the decision that they were going to stay behind and get to the bottom of this. They knew that they wanted time to thoroughly examine all the remains and look for clues, but they realized that they were potentially dealing with something unnatural, like a horrific curse, and that this is why there were just so many bodies up here. But deep down, they really wanted to just feel validation and find that there was a scientific explanation behind all of it. For the next several hours, many of the men carefully made their way around the lake, documenting everything they could find. They took pages of notes and all sorts of measurements as best they could with the materials and tools they had. During this, they found other strange things. There weren't just skeletons. They also found various personal items of all shapes and sizes. Everything from bamboo sticks to wooden utensils and, strangely, umbrellas that were scattered among the remains in the snow and ice. But the strangest of all were leather sandals, and let me tell you why. Because Madwell had been living in this region for a very long time, it would be obvious that he was aware of the typical footwear worn by people in the region. They're a kind of sandal called chapals, and they were noticeably larger than any of the sandals worn by people in the region. That alone told Madwell that something was very off about all this, despite there being hundreds of bodies, but he knew that the sandal part was a very important detail. Now, because of the harsh conditions at nighttime in just the general area, the expedition did not have enough supplies to stay longer and examine things closer. They would have to head back and report this to the authorities. The expedition spent the next 5 to 6 days slowly coming down the Himalayan mountains to the next point of civilization. Normally, you would think that if you alerted the authorities about possibly several hundred bodies just sitting out there in the wilderness that it would trigger an immediate mass investigation. And normally that would be the case, but this was in 1942, and India was still under British rule. Unfortunately, at the time, the British government was too preoccupied with other things like World War II to investigate. When they found out about what had been discovered, they weren't really concerned with the dead bodies themselves or even how they died. They were more concerned about the security implications because they speculated that these skeletons were actually Japanese soldiers, which meant that the enemy had somehow managed to infiltrate India through some route that nobody was aware of. And if this was the case, this raised some serious alarms. The government knew that if this went on, they could be susceptible to all sorts of attacks, so they needed to act quickly. They launched their own investigation, again, not to get to the bottom of why the skeletons were at this lake, but rather just to find out whether or not their presence alone posed a threat to the war effort. After some time, the government felt as though they had sufficiently investigated and determined that all the bodies were in fact not from Japanese soldiers, and therefore their presence in India did not pose a threat at all. Again, Britain didn't really spend a whole lot of time from an archaeological perspective trying to find out the mystery behind the bodies. They just wanted to make sure that they were safe, so any investigation that was done was very surface level, at least to the public. But even in their investigation, they concluded that these bodies were much older than anyone originally thought. Now, because there was no more security concern, the British authorities just closed the case. Of course, there was a chance that down the line they might get around to it when they had the resources, but who's to say when that's gonna happen? They closed the books on the case, and that was pretty much it. People were not really traveling there, and a lot of the people who lived in and around the area just generally avoided it altogether. For about 13 years, it was kind of just this really taboo place that you did not want to go to. It was believed that whoever these people were that were found had clearly died because, again, they were cursed. End of story. But in 1955, a government deputy minister in newly independent India decided to publicly announce to the world the existence of these skeletons. And it was because of his announcement that this discovery gained widespread attention. At this point in 1955, World War II was over, and India was now governing its own affairs. It was at this point that the first official investigation was launched in pursuit of actually figuring out who these skeletons were. But remember, just like the expedition 13 years before, this was no small undertaking. I mean, this lake required quite a bit of a trek, and to get there, one had to travel 30 miles over very rough terrain that takes about 5 days from the nearest settlement. And this is a journey that will truly test any seasoned traveler because, you're going through thick oak forests and alpine meadows all across the Himalayas. It's freezing cold at night, and there's not a lot of coverage depending on where you are. Even by today's standards, with all of our advanced equipment, it's still considered a very dangerous journey. So you could imagine that in 1955, they were taking all the necessary precautions to go into one of the most remote places on the planet. When the expedition eventually reached the lake, the conditions had changed some 13 years ago. The expedition did the best they could though, and they were able to collect some samples in addition to various artifacts. But upon returning, they realized they would need more specimens to fully uncover the mystery of who or what killed all these people and just left their bodies along the shoreline. The following year, in 1956, 3 separate investigations were also conducted where they discovered even more remains, and because they planned it out better, they were very meticulous about how they conducted their studies and what sort of evidence they brought back. Those on the expedition itself were very paranoid the entire time because they too were convinced that this was cursed land, and that's why all these people had perished. They were risking their lives to be a part of this expedition for science, and fortunately, none of them died during this in-depth investigation, but they were still pretty perplexed by the data they got back. Right away, they started comparing all the ages of those who were deceased along the shoreline and realized that the majority of them were healthy, middle-aged adults around 35 to 40. And there were even a few elderly. So surely this had to mean something, right? Well, what was also revealed in their forensic analysis is that these weren't random people from around the region or even people who were traveling from far away. There were two genetically distinct groups among the bodies, but they couldn't exactly pinpoint what race or where on the earth they had come from. All they can make out was that one group was notably taller and had longer and narrower skulls, the same ones who had also had the oversized sandals that Madwell noticed back in 1942. The other group of remains came from those with smaller, rounder heads. They can conclude that there were definitely relatives among these bodies, but again, nothing concrete to definitively say that these people came from this region of the world and that these people came from this region of the world. This made the forensic teams increasingly frustrated because it just didn't make any sense. But probably the most bizarre finding out of everything is that many of the skulls, not all of them, but many of them, had this very distinctive depression fracture, all nearly identical. That meant that these people were struck on top of their skull from a blunt, round object. Not all individuals showed this consistent head trauma, but there was more than enough to create a pattern that demanded an explanation. The forensic team started thinking that this was possibly some kind of cult ritual or maybe a suicide pact. They weren't really sure. But to understand it further, they needed to first know how old these bodies were. And at the time, the expedition reached out to Oxford University and sent them the remains to conduct radiocarbon dating on the skeletons. Radiocarbon dating is obviously far from perfect, so they got second opinions as well, just to try to get a ballpark to figure out what they were dealing with. The consensus was that whoever these people were, they had died sometime between 500 and 800 years ago, so obviously very old remains. Now keep in mind that even after all of this detailed forensic analysis, they still weren't really closer to solving anything. I mean, sure, they had some answers about genetics to an extent, and they had some rough ideas, but they weren't sure what to make of it all. Years later, in 2003, National Geographic decided that, you know what, they're going to conduct their own expedition and figure this out once and for all. Because this was in 2003, obviously much of the equipment and technology in general had increased dramatically, so not only was the expedition easier, but they were able to retrieve more evidence and just do an overall more thorough job in their own analysis. They retrieved roughly 30 skeletons from the surrounding area and parts of the lake, and they themselves were shocked by how many skeletons still had flesh attached. They believed that they were going to get some answers, finally. However, when they got the bodies back to their labs and they started doing the same analysis that the previous expeditions had done, they didn't find what they were looking for. And in fact, they ended up with more questions. Based on everything they knew about this location and the condition and state of these bodies, is that at some point there was some massive, singular, catastrophic event roughly around the 9th century. Exactly what, though, they weren't sure and could not explain these large fractures in many of the skulls. One might think that after looking at the data, you would just be like, obviously there was a large battle that took place here, or maybe there were bandits, or that there was several violent, bloody skirmishes, but that's not the case. And in fact, according to all the expeditions that spent days and weeks, it turns out that there is no recorded history of any such battles taking place. There aren't even any weapons. In fact, the only thing remotely close that was found were spearheads. But because of the condition in which they were found and how many, it was concluded that they were used for hunting and not for war. Additionally, none of the skeletons ever recovered or analyzed showed any signs of being stabbed. Again, only the blunt force trauma to a portion of the skulls recovered. In 2019, the most comprehensive study of this event was published. This was a 5-year research project that involved 28 co-authors from 16 institutions that spanned all across India. I mean, this was a big deal. We're talking about a very, very in-depth examination targeting genome-wide DNA of the 38 skeletons that were extracted. But unlike all the other previous expeditions, they came to a different conclusion. There were not only 2 groups, but actually 3 distinct groups. Out of the 38 skeletons, 23 of them, from what they could tell, originated from South Asia just based on their ancestry. Given the location of this lake, it seemed reasonable, but 14 of them had Eastern Mediterranean ancestry. To get this data, they had constructed a very detailed dietary profile of every single victim, so they could see that they all came from different cultures and regions. This meant that some of the people who died here were a very long way from home, and somehow, many, many years ago, in a time when traveling to this particular section of the Himalayas was so much more difficult, they found a way to get there. You need to understand that hundreds of years ago, traveling to this extremely remote lake in the Himalayas would have been outright impossible for the majority of the population. Whoever these people were had clearly put a lot of effort and time into traveling. For what reason, no one knew, nor did they know how or why they had died in the manner of which they did. To make matters even stranger, when they used new dating techniques to try and see if they could pinpoint the exact dates, they realized something. They initially thought that everybody had died at the same time from some singular catastrophic event, but the data showed something different. A group of them had died roughly 200 to 300 years ago, but the rest of them died many, many, many years prior to this, which meant that groups of people would travel to this location and die somehow and just be left there. Pretty much all teams who spent a lot of time going over all the data who were looking into this were flabbergasted. This is a location that is so remote and inhospitable and is not near any major or known trade route. It's not really somewhere you can just mistakenly wander off into. You have to know exactly where you're going, and people have to deliberately travel here. One of their theories was that all these people had actually died because of some ancient pathogen. Maybe they had become infected somehow and were sent here as an effective means to be executed and kind of kept away from the rest of civilization. However, once it turned out that there wasn't any evidence to support that theory, all they could do is look to a legend within their own region that could possibly explain what was happening. It's said that a king and queen once embarked on a great pilgrimage to honor the goddess Nanda Devi, which the mountains to the northeast of this lake are named after. The pilgrimage did not end at this lake, but at another lake known as Hamkund Lake. But in order to reach Hamkund Lake, you had to travel directly around this lake with all the bodies. And at the time, there were very strict rules that prohibited women, children, elderly, leather goods, and various other things beyond certain points of the trail, so it was a very strict journey. But the king and queen made a vital mistake. For whatever reason, they broke this sacred set of rules and brought with them women, children, musicians, dancers, all beyond the allowed points, knowing full well what they were doing. The gods and goddesses took great offense in this act of disrespect, and at the time, the pilgrimage were making their way through this lake when the hailstorm came, slaughtering all of them as an act of divine judgment. 1,000 years later, a completely separate pilgrimage traveled through this area and were also slaughtered. They couldn't conclude if the hailstorms had simply killed everybody or if that the hailstorms had just killed one group but then didn't kill the other. I mean, based on the skeletons alone, it seemed as if they had died of different causes and not all from the same thing. In recent years, a researcher named R.S. Neg decided to do some digging into this mystery and discovered that for the last several hundred years, there are historical records about people falling from this treacherous ridge nearby and falling to their death on the shores of this lake. So many people had died from falling off of this ridge that it earned the nickname Alley of Death. It was taken very seriously, and the government, on multiple occasions, warned travelers who would go out here to be very careful. Around 1931, they realized that with all the recent accounts coming in, they needed to take the situation much more seriously. In addition to people falling off this ledge and other people dying there in mysterious ways, there were pilgrims making a trek to this lake and making a sacrifice ritual known as Atmosarg. In Hindi, this translates roughly to self-sacrifice, but it's not a philosophical concept. It's a terrifying life or death decision. It means completely giving up your own self for a higher cause. Think of the slow, quiet, agonizing fate of a monk who simply stops eating and wastes away. But other than just outright banning access to the area of the Himalayas, there wasn't a whole lot that the government could do. In fact, even with the expeditions going on and them doing all of this forensic analysis to try and figure out what was happening, the government kind of just had to leave this site alone. I mean, what else could they possibly do? As time has gone on, stories about this lake and what's happened here have naturally made their way out into the world. In 2009, in an effort to capitalize on this and, try to restore the reputation of this site, a company out of Bangalore offered to take people out to this lake on these organized group treks. And within years, the lake saw a large influx of tourists coming and going to this lake and exploring around. Several began taking bones from around the lake as kind of a souvenir, even though they weren't supposed to. By 2018, so 9 years later, it had gotten so bad between the obvious ecological damage that was taking place and people stealing bones that the Indian government had to act. They came in, they shut it down permanently in hopes that they would be able to save any endangered species and protect what little remains of this very unique archaeological site. Today, nobody's sure exactly why people have died here and what the real answer is to this mystery. It's estimated that around 800 people have died here, and their remains are still there. The lake is called Rupkund Lake, or more ominously fitting, Skeleton Lake. In December of 2004, a man named Terry and his friend Andy were traveling the backroads of New Zealand. Their trip had taken them deep into the Kaimanawa forest down this remote dirt road. And after about 7 miles, Andy was starting to wonder what the heck they were doing out there. But Terry wasn't lost. He was searching for something that, according to official records, didn't exist. Now, at this point, even Terry has to admit that it seems to be taking a while, because now it feels like they're getting further and further away from civilization. He figures that they must be somewhere southeast of Lake Taupo by now. But Terry's determined to find this place, and so the two of them keep their eyes glued to the side of the road, waiting for the first sign of anything unusual to pop out of the thick vegetation. Now, because what they're looking for has no signs, markers, or anything else to indicate it's there, they almost miss it. But Andy's eyes light up at the last minute, and he points to it. It's right up ahead. There's a stone structure that's poking through the underbrush, and that must be it. So Terry pulls over, they both get out of their car, and they start making their way through the forest towards this structure. Terry's getting excited, his heart's racing. He's just, we found it. This is a bucket list item for him. But even though he knows what to expect, he still can't believe what it is they're seeing. Right there, in front of them, is what appears to be this massive stone surface made up of these huge rectangular blocks, 6 feet wide, which about 5 feet tall. And each of these has perfectly straight lines running both horizontally, this is vertical actually, horizontally and vertically, all fitting together perfectly in a grid, like you'd expect for any other ancient building. And so Terry and Andy, they're just standing there, they're taking it all in, they're just, wow. They're in amazement. And even though there's a lot of moss hiding a lot of the surface, there's a big tree that's growing out of the top, and the precision with which these blocks have been arranged is obvious. The corners are symmetrical. Each one fits together perfectly with flat ends, and they're all placed in levels going up and back into the side of the hill. Terry just leans down for a closer look, and he realizes that right here, he could see deeper into the crevice between two of the blocks. Now, obviously, he's shocked by this because he can clearly see the uniformity of these blocks, which continues all the way inside. nice and square, straight lines all the way in. Now folks, this is not an optical illusion. There's no denying what it looks like. It looks like an enormous man-made stone wall in the middle of the New Zealand forest. This is like something you'd see on Easter Island. Clear, obvious evidence of an ancient culture with sophisticated knowledge of stoneworking. There's one glaring problem. According to experts, this formation is completely natural. The structure, known as Kaimanawa Wall, has been one of the most controversial archaeological topics in New Zealand for nearly 3 decades now. And the story of how this wall was discovered, what it might mean, and why it's been essentially hidden from the public is even more bizarre than the wall itself. And in fact, it all started in the early 1990s when a researcher named Barry Brailsford was investigating stories about ancient structures in New Zealand. Now at the time, he had heard about rumors and strange formations in the Kaimanawa forest, and he was determined to get to the bottom of it and find them. So when he finally located and examined the Kaimanawa wall himself, he was convinced he'd found something extraordinary. Barry went public, and in 1996, he actually published an article that challenged everything we thought we knew about New Zealand's history. He claimed that the wall was at least 2,000 years old. As for whoever built it, Barry believed that it had been built by a people called Waitaha. Now, we know that the Maori tribes by this name existed, and in fact, there are tribal members that identify by this name today. But Barry claimed that his version of the Waitaha were distinct. He said that these people were New Zealand's actual first settlers, arriving way before the Maori. And as if this idea wasn't controversial enough, Barry went on to say that the Kaimanawa Wall provided a clear connection between New Zealand and ancient civilizations, just like those in Egypt and South America. He said that the Waitaha had been nearly exterminated by the Maori when they arrived, and that this wall was some of the last remaining evidence of their lost civilization. Interestingly, Barry went on to provide 12 different places of evidence for why he believed the wall was artificially constructed. But honestly, we don't need to go through all of those because, just look at the thing. It looks like a wall. We don't have to buy his entire Waitaha idea to say that much. But either way, this article of Barry's caused an immediate uproar. People began flocking to the Kaimanawa forest just to see this mysterious wall with their own eyes. Some came away convinced that it was evidence of a lost civilization, but many others weren't so convinced. But everyone did agree on one thing, that this structure was unlike anything else in New Zealand. So maybe the Maori people built the wall. Well, the problem is that when the Maori built things with stone, they never built anything quite like this. In fact, their traditional structures are mostly made of wood and other organic materials. So if the wall is man-made, then who built it? And why is it sitting unmarked in a forest? And why aren't there any other ancient structures nearby? As sightseers came and went, the controversy eventually grew so intense, authorities actually banned public access to the entire area. They said it was for safety reasons, but you know how this goes, right? Now there was a conspiracy to hide the truth about the wall. Now in the meantime, New Zealand's scientific community, they decided to settle the matter once and for all. And so they got a team of archaeologists and geologists to finally go out to the area and examine it. And the plan was to honestly evaluate this site and put to rest once and for all whether it was natural or artificial. The scientists focused on the joints between the blocks, and they noticed matching micro irregularities along the joints, which is just a fancy way of saying that there were tiny imperfections that lined up perfectly between adjacent blocks. They fit together at a microscopic level, essentially. The study also put to bed the idea that the joints were perfectly straight. They only look that way from a distance. In reality, they're pretty uneven. So for researchers, all of this pointed to the likelihood that these stones were actually not man-made. Stoneworking would have left tool marks on the blocks, but there weren't any, and no tools would have mirrored those micro irregularities on blocks that were next to each other. On the other hand, a large chunk of stone that had fractured would show those matching imperfections. In fact, The researchers argued that's exactly what you'd expect to see. So what kind of rock did the scientists say it was? Geologists identified the rock as something called jointed Rangataki ignimbrite. Want that translated? Ignimbrite is a type of volcanic rock formed when volcanic ash and debris settle and then compact after an eruption. And Rangataki ignimbrite is specific to the Taupo volcanic zone, which puts this so-called wall at around 330,000 years old. Now, this type of rock is important because being volcanic, as you guys know, it cools after it forms. And according to geologists, when it does cool, it contracts and then sometimes makes these very regular fracture patterns. In other words, exactly the kind of vertical and horizontal joints that you see on the wall. Now, the official conclusion was definitive. The Kaimana wall was not made by people. The government officially designated it a natural rock formation and put up signs warning that it was illegal to interfere with or damage natural features on public conservation land. But as you guys know, and probably while you're watching this, not everybody accepted the explanation. Alternative historians, something that I recently learned what they're called, point out that no other ignimbrite formations in New Zealand look like this one. They're very unique. The blocks are very precise, too precise. They fit together too well, and the wall faces perfectly to the north. And we all know that a lot of ancient cultures were obsessed with cardinal directions and star alignments. Why is that? Well, that's for another video. Now, to further support their theories, these researchers see an obvious motive to discredit the wall, and they say that revealing the truth behind it would append New Zealand's history. According to alternative historians, admitting that the wall is artificial would mean admitting that New Zealand's history is completely different than what we've been taught. It would mean that an ancient civilization existed in New Zealand thousands of years ago. So what do you think? Natural or man-made? I mean, it's one thing to sit back and offer your opinion, but according to those who have visited the Kaimana wall, it's something else to run your hands along those straight joints and symmetrical corners. I mean, it doesn't look natural and it doesn't feel natural. But either way, in the end, the controversy will continue. Just like in any controversial subject, both sides believe they're right and they will both die on that hill. Which for you and I sucks because it means we'll never know the truth. Unfortunately, folks, all of it, everything we talked about today remains a mystery. And because you guys made it to the very end of the video, on a sunny morning in 1903, a 30-year-old Austrian engineer named Arthur Poznański stood on a windswept plateau in western Bolivia, staring at something that didn't make any sense. He had traveled weeks to reach this remote location, about 3,800 meters above sea level near the shores of Lake Titicaca. He'd come here because he'd heard stories from people about ancient ruins that defied explanation, but now he was at a place that the locals called Puma Punku, which meant door of the puma. He realized the stories hadn't done justice though to what he was seeing, and the stones in front of him were enormous, some weighing over 100 tons, but it wasn't their size that blew him away. These blocks had been cut with surfaces so smooth and angles so sharp that when he tried to slip a sheet of paper between the two, he couldn't do it. The joints were completely flush. And this had supposedly been achieved by people who didn't even have metal tools. So he took his time, he walked slowly around the ruins, just running his hands along the stone surfaces, feeling for any imperfections or any sign of crude workmanship that would make sense for something built by ancient people. But as far as he could see, every cut was perfect and every angle was exact. This was at a machine level in terms of precision. Now keep in mind that Arthur was an engineer by training, not an archaeologist. Local archaeologists and other historians just claim that they were built by the Tiwanaku culture, which was roughly around 1,300 years ago. He knew that that was not the answer to this mystery, and he was going to find out what. Over the next several weeks, he began conducting his own surveys and measurements. He sketched every structure, photographed the stones, and documented every unusual feature. He became more convinced that something extraordinary had happened here, something that mainstream archaeology was just missing out on completely. One day, while he was measuring the alignment of a structure called the Colossusaya Temple, he noticed something strange. The corners seem to be oriented to mark the sunrise and sunset on the solstices. This wasn't unusual because lots of ancient structures were aligned with celestial events. But when he checked the current position of the sun during the solstice, the alignment was off by several degrees actually. The implications were that the Earth's axis wobbles very slowly over thousands of years, a phenomenon called axial precession, which meant that the position of celestial objects relative to Earth gradually shifts. If you built a structure aligned to the solstice sunrise today, in 1,000 years that alignment would be slightly off too. He began calculating, and based on how far off the alignment was, he could work backwards to figure out when the structure would have been perfectly aligned. After doing very thorough math and rechecking his calculations, he had his answer. According to what he did, the temple would have been perfectly aligned with the solstices around 15,000 BC, which would make Pumapunku not 1,300 years old, but actually around 17,000 years old. To verify this, he spent the next several days measuring other structures, including the famous Gateway of the Sun, and each time his calculations gave him similar dates. Everything pointed to the same impossible conclusion, that there was a civilization that had been built at the end of the last ice age. But it gets even more interesting because as he spent more time walking around, he noticed what appeared to be ancient shorelines carved into the surrounding mountains. And these wave-cut terraces were hundreds of feet above the current level of Lake Titicaca. Local indigenous had legends about a great flood that had destroyed an ancient civilization, and so when he looked at the layout and the structure of these places, he realized it looked exactly like something else. A port. The massive blocks, the precise construction. This would have been an ancient shoreline, and all this was starting to fall into place and make perfect sense. This place had not been built by simple farmers 1,300 years ago. This was an advanced maritime civilization, and when water levels were completely different. This was evidence of lost technology, a civilization that had been destroyed by a catastrophic flood. After this, he became obsessed with proving his theory. He spent month after month at the site just taking more measurements, gathering as much data as he possibly could. He even facilitated visits from a German astronomical team in the 1920s to help verify his calculations and make sure that he wasn't just crazy. He wrote guidebooks and gave tours to visiting scholars and even lobbied the Bolivian government to recognize the site's true importance. By the 1930s and 40s, he had become the dominant authority on Tiwanaku and Pumapunku. He spent more time studying the site than anyone else and had published multiple books, including a massive 4-volume opus. His 1945 book, Tiwanaku, the Cradle of American Man, presented his theory that Pumapunku was the birthplace of civilization in the Americas. He even developed theories about the people who had built it. By examining the skulls from tombs around the site, he concluded that there had been 2 distinct populations, an older, more advanced race with elongated skulls, and a younger, more primitive race with normal skulls. Us, humans. He published papers on the anthropology of this in 1937 and a book called What is Race in 1943. And he argued that Pumapunku proved the existence of a lost master race that had spread civilization around the world before being destroyed. Arthur died in 1946 and was absolutely convinced that he had rewritten human history. However, mainstream archaeology, science in general, refused to accept it. It would turn out that Arthur Poznański was completely wrong about almost everything. In the late 40s and 50s, scientists developed a technique called radiocarbon dating. This method could determine the age of organic materials pretty accurately. It was supposedly far more accurate than the calculations Arthur had relied on. So when they carbon dated the materials from these 2 sites, Pumapunku and Tiwanaku, the results were definitive, that the sites had actually been built around, 1300 BC. Arthur had assumed that the structures were meant to align perfectly with the solstices, but there was no evidence that the Tiwanaku builders had intended such precision. That the few degrees of difference that Arthur had detected were simply the result of construction variation, not years of axial precession. And the ancient shorelines weren't shorelines, but geologists had proved they were natural erosion patterns in the rock and were unrelated to water levels. Archaeology declared that the site had never been a port, and authors' theories about two distinct races were just flat out wrong. Modern DNA analysis would later show that the population of this area was genetically homogeneous, and that because of that, the skull variations he had observed were normal human diversity, not evidence of a master non-human race. And even Arthur's basic premise that the stonework being too advanced for ancient people was also wrong, because experimental archaeologists demonstrated that the precise cuts and joints at this location could be achieved using bronze tools, wooden measuring devices, and of course, enormous amounts of skilled labor. Keep in mind that the scientific community had been very skeptical of Arthur's claims from the very beginning. He had had a public dispute with a respected archaeologist, but was so convinced of his own theory, so dedicated to his research, that he had dismissed all criticism as narrow-minded. But here's the truly strange part, because what if Arthur Poznański wasn't wrong? What if he truly uncovered something so profound history would have to be rewritten if released to the public? In 1969, Eric von Daniken cited Arthur's 15,000-year date in his best-selling book, Chariots of the Gods, using it as evidence for ancient astronauts. In the 1990s and 2000s, Graham Hancock referenced his work to support theories about lost civilizations. This begs the question that you guys are going to have to answer yourselves. Did he uncover something about our past that he wasn't supposed to, or did he just fabricate lies for the sake of fame and notoriety? The truth remains a mystery. In the summer of 1966, an archaeologist named Jack D. Eaton was trudging through the dense jungle of southeastern Mexico. He was in the state of Campeche on the Yucatan Peninsula, and he was there as a part of this big joint study between National Geographic and a university. They were planning to do this major archaeological excavation of an ancient Mayan city called Bolivian. But before they could start digging, they needed Jack to survey the area to make sure they weren't missing anything important. And so for days, he had been hacking his way through the thick vegetation with his small team, and they would map out the terrain and taking all the notes they needed, basically doing all the unglamorous groundwork that comes before any of these big digs. It was hot, it was humid, and Jack wasn't expecting to find much. His job was just to make sure there wasn't anything else in the immediate vicinity that they should know about. But on this morning, him and his team were about 1.25 miles west of the city when they noticed the ground beneath their feet was starting to rise, and they were walking up what seemed to be a natural elevation, like a small hill. And as any archaeologist will tell you, when you're in ancient Mayan territory and you find a hill, you pay attention. Because the Maya, they like to build on high ground. It gave them strategic advantages, better drainage, all sorts of practical benefits. So Jack and his team start climbing, pushing through the undergrowth, and after maybe about 20 minutes, they reach what seems to be the top. Initially, it looks to be just more jungle, but one of his assistants calls out and points to something that's partially hidden by vines and just centuries of plant growth. It's a solid stone structure. And not just a pile of rocks, but clearly something that was built by hands. And so Jack is getting excited, his heart's racing. This is exactly the kind of thing they're trained to look for. And as they begin very carefully clearing away some of the vegetation, there isn't just one. There are multiple, and they're all constructed in a very specific architectural style that he immediately recognizes. It's called Rio-Bec, and it's the same style at Bolivian and other classic period Mayan sites in this region. And so over the next several hours, Jack and his team work to get a better sense of what they found. It becomes clear that this is an entire settlement, a small Mayan city that's been swallowed up by the jungle and forgotten. The buildings are all in various states of decay, but they're substantial structures made of carefully cut limestone. And out of all these structures, something grabs his attention, and it's located in the eastern section of what appears to be a small square or plaza. As he approaches it, clearing away more of the vegetation, he realizes he's looking at an entrance, a doorway into a structure. The entire portal has been carved and shaped to look like something very specific, and as more of it is revealed, he can hardly believe it. The doorway is designed to look like the open mouth of an enormous serpent. Now, to understand why this was such a big deal, you have to know a little bit about Mayan culture. Serpents were hugely important in their mythology. They represented the connection between earth and the sky, between the physical world and the spiritual one. And one serpent deity in particular, Itzamna, was considered one of the most powerful in their pantheon. But what Jack is looking at isn't just a symbolic representation. The ancient Maya who built this, probably around 700 BC, based on the construction techniques, they had gone to great lengths to make this doorway look as realistic as possible. The lintel above the door and the threshold below are carved to look like rows of teeth, and on either side of the entrance, spiral designs represent its eyes. And the entire facade of the building curves and undulates to suggest the serpent's body. But here's what really got to him as he stood there looking. To enter, you literally had to walk into the mouth of the serpent. You had to pass between its teeth, under its eyes. And for ancient Maya who used this structure, the act of entering would have been deeply symbolic. It would have been like being swallowed by the deity, passing from the ordinary world into the sacred space within. So Jack spends the rest of the day documenting the structure, which he designates as Structure 2 in his notes. He realizes that this wasn't some minor outpost. This was a thriving settlement that existed during the classic period of Mayan civilization. And based on some of the other buildings he's seen, like the Serpent, for example, was built even earlier. Jack would later determine that this city once reached its peak power of influence around 300 AD, making it one of the earliest major settlements in the entire region, and it would have housed thousands of people. And for some reason, around the year 1100, the city was abandoned. People left, and the jungle began its slow work of reclamation. What's interesting is this city was only about 2 kilometers or just over a mile from Bacan. The two cities would have been inhabited at the same time. They even shared the same architectural style. They probably traded with each other, maybe even fought with each other. Jack was given the honor of naming this establishment. And even today, you yourself can go here and visit this site. The ancient city that Jack discovered is known as Chicana, or Mouth of the Serpent. And because you guys made it this far into the episode, I want you to all comment below, supernatural. So that way I know who made it to the end and who didn't. On the afternoon of August 27, 1849, a lieutenant in the U.S. Army Corps of Topographical Engineers stood next to his horses in the middle of the New Mexico desert, wiping sweat from his forehead with his dusty sleeve. He was leading a small detachment of soldiers that had just broken away from Colonel Washington's main force, and they were supposed to be heading back to Santa Fe after a brutal military campaign against the Navajo. The campaign had been successful, if you could call it that. They'd secured a peace treaty after a nasty skirmish where the Navajo leader, Narbona, had been killed. And now, as the main army marched east toward home, this lieutenant had been given permission to take a quick detour with a handful of men to investigate something their Navajo guide had mentioned. Supposedly, there were these old ruins nearby, maybe worth documenting for the official report. Army topographical engineers were basically the scientists of the military, and they were always poking around looking for interesting geographical features or old settlements to map. The lieutenant had already seen dozens of abandoned native dwellings scattered across the land, just, small structures, maybe a few rooms, nothing special, so he figured this wasn't going to be all that exciting. But the guide, who had been walking ahead of them for hours without saying much, suddenly stopped and pointed toward a gap in the mesa ahead. He then said something in Navajo that the interpreter translated as the house in the blackened gap. The lieutenant, of course, thought that was a very oddly poetic way to describe old ruins, but he figured it was just how the Navajo talked about these things. What was very strange, though, was the guide's entire demeanor changed as they got closer. He had been very comfortable leading them through this area, but now as they approached, he seemed almost afraid. And he kept looking over his shoulder, and he was speaking in whispers, even though there was nobody around. The lieutenant could obviously sense the there was something wrong, and the guy just told him that his people didn't like to go to this place because the ancient ones had built it. But of course, he just nodded and made a mental note for his journal, writing it off as typical native superstition. As they rode through the gap in the mesa, the lieutenant expected to see maybe a handful of crumbling buildings, but as the canyon opened up before them, he pulled his horse to a stop and just stared, because rising from the canyon floor were walls, and massive ones. Stone walls that stood 3 to 4 stories high, stretching across the landscape in what was kind of like this perfect geometric pattern. The artist traveling with them, a man named Kern, was supposed to be sketching maps and other notable features, actually dropped his materials when he saw it. And in fact, the nearest building was enormous. The lieutenant tried to count the rooms as he could see from the outside, and he kept losing track after 200. All the men could clearly observe that the walls were precisely cut out of stone and fitted together so perfectly you couldn't even slip a knife blade between them. The guy, though, just started freaking out and refused to go any closer, and explained that his people had a name. They called this place the Horizontal Rock Gap, which meant that it had basically been empty since before the guide's grandfather's time. Supposedly, the builders had been very powerful who had vanished long ago, and that's all he would say about it. The lieutenant and his men dismounted and approached on foot, and every man in that detachment felt something shift in their understanding of where they were and what they were looking at. The first structure they entered didn't make any sense, because it was shaped like a perfect letter D with the curved side facing south. The lieutenant had studied architecture at West Point, and he knew this wasn't random, that this was by design. Now, the Spanish had already been in Mexico for centuries. Maybe they had built some kind of massive mission here that had been forgotten. But Kern pointed out something that made that theory fall apart. The wooden beams in the ceiling, the ones holding up the multiple stories of stone, were ancient and so weathered and dry that they looked like they might turn to dust if you touched them. Whatever this place was, it had been abandoned for a very, very long time. At this point, the lieutenant had ordered his men to spread out and explore, but to be very careful because the structures, while they looked stable, could possibly collapse at any moment. And this is when he went around and took measurements and counted doorways and made all the notes he could possible in his journal. After he got done, he had a really hard time making sense of his notes because the main building alone had at least 600 rooms, which is bigger than most American towns in 1849. As they explored further, they found another massive structure a short distance away, just as large, just as complex. And in fact, the canyon was full of them. They were so mind-blown that they were convinced nobody was going to believe them. When they filed their report back in Washington, people would think they were making it up or had been drinking. One of the soldiers then called out because he had found something carved into a rock face, symbols, writing of some kind. And so the lieutenant and his team hurried over and they just stared at these inscriptions. They weren't Spanish. There were no native languages that he recognized because they were older. Nobody had any idea what it meant, but they traced the symbols onto paper, thinking someone back east would be able to decipher them. That night, they made camp at a respectful distance from the ruins, and all of them just had this really strange feeling about what they had found that day, and they didn't really want to sleep any closer to the ruins than they absolutely had to. But over the course of this evening, as the lieutenant was compiling his final notes together for the main report, a soldier had suggested that maybe it was built by the Aztecs, that maybe their empire had actually extended much further north than anyone knew, or it could be some completely unknown civilization. Regardless, they were all convinced that this was going to change the way that everybody thought about the American Southwest. And over the next several days, they systematically explored and documented the canyon. His team produced detailed floor plans and sketches of all the major structures. They collected pottery fragments and tools, and they wrapped them up to take them back as evidence. And on their final day, the lieutenant climbed up to a high point where he could see the entire complex spread out below him. And by his count, there were at least 10 major structures, each containing hundreds of rooms. It's evident that whatever ancient culture lived here had to have been in the thousands, which meant they were thriving. More disturbing is that there were no signs of violence or evidence of invasion or disease. It's like they just simply walked away one day and never came back. The Navajo guide they brought with them refused to even go up there, saying that this culture vanished because they had become too powerful and the spirits had forced them to leave. What the lieutenant didn't know was that he had just documented one of the most important archaeological sites in North America. The structures he measured and mapped had been built between 850 and 1250 by the ancestral Puebloans. This sophisticated culture had created a trade network spanning thousands of miles. The city had been a center of commerce, ceremony, and political power for 4 centuries before being abandoned in the 13th century. The building he had spent so much time originally measuring was Pueblo Bonito, which would become one of the most studied archaeological sites in the Americas. The symbols he'd copied would eventually be recognized as part of a complex system of astronomical markers and ceremonial notations. Additionally, the Navajo weren't the only ones who knew about this place. The Hopi and the Zuni all considered it part of their ancestral homeland. And within a year's time, the lieutenant's report began to circulate widely. Over the coming decades, thousands of artifacts would be excavated. It all revealed a culture of incredible sophistication, from turquoise jewelry from hundreds of miles away, copper bells from Mexico, seashells from the Pacific, feathers from tropical birds. This was an extremely advanced trade network. Even the architecture was aligned with solar and lunar cycles with a precision that wouldn't be fully understood until the 1970s. The place the lieutenant had spent those few days documenting was Chaco Canyon, and his report would be cited by every archaeologist who came after him, the baseline from which all future research would build. The lieutenant who led this expedition was James Harvey Simpson. His accidental detour to investigate some ruins would transform our understanding of American prehistory forever. On the morning of September 3rd, 1973, a 45-year-old miner named Cobus Venter climbed into the Wonderstone silver mine near Ottosdale, South Africa, adjusting his lamp on his helmet for what must have been the 1,000th time in his career. He had been working in the mine since he was 17, and after nearly 3 decades underground, he was pretty confident how to handle himself. And in fact, he was kind of a legend among the younger miners. They even called him Dioman, or the old man, even though he wasn't really that old. It was more about respect, really. But this morning, Cobus was leading a small crew into a section of the mine that had just been opened up the week before. They'd blasted through about 500 feet of rock to reach a new vein of pyrophyllite. That's the soft, soapy mineral they were mining. It's used in cosmetics, paint, just a variety of different things. It's not particularly valuable, but there was a steady demand for it. So the entrance to the mine itself was really just a hole in the side of a hill. There's really nothing fancy going on at all. There's no elevator or really any railway. It's just a single steep path that wound down into the dark. So as Cobus began his descent that morning, followed by 3 younger miners, he did what he always did, and that is he ran his hands along the wall to feel the stone. Experienced miners will tell you that a mine talks to you. Not literally, obviously, but the rocks do give you signals. Temperature changes, moisture levels, even the way the sound reverberates. It all tells you about what's ahead. And that morning, as Cobus descended deeper and deeper down into the earth, the rock felt different than it normally does. Now, he couldn't exactly put his finger on it, but there was just something that felt off. Now, they were about 500 feet underground, in a tunnel that was maybe 6 feet high and 4 feet wide, just big enough for a man to walk through if he ducked his head a bit. The walls were rough, and they were still showing the scars from the dynamite blast that had created this very passage. And every few feet, there were these wooden support beams holding up the ceiling, though honestly, they were like toothpicks compared to the millions of tons of rock directly above them. Cobus's lamp illuminated maybe 20 feet ahead of him, and beyond that was just solid, complete darkness. The kind of darkness you can only get deep underground where sunlight has never reached and never will. This episode of What Lurks Beneath is sponsored by Mint Mobile. Now, as you're hearing about these strange spheres and even you are convinced that there's no way these things could be natural, you'd be right. I mean, some things in life are way too complicated. Your cell phone bill shouldn't be one of them. That's why you should switch to Mint Mobile. They've reimagined the wireless experience by putting the whole thing online. No stores, no salespeople, no nonsense, just premium wireless that starts at $15 a month. Every plan comes with unlimited talk and text on the nation's largest 5G network, plus free calling to Canada, Mexico, and the UK. And if you're on the go, hotspots included, up to 10 gigabytes on unlimited plans. But here's the real anomaly. You actually save more by buying in bulk. Mint offers 3, 6, and 12-month plans, so the more months you grab up front, the more you save. You can even pick your own data size, 5 gigabytes, 15, 20, or unlimited. So you're not paying for data you'll never use. If you're worried about switching, well, that's pretty easy too. You can sign up and activate right from your couch in minutes with eSIM. You keep your number, your contacts, everything stays the same. So if you're ready to stop overpaying for your phone and start simplifying like a sane human being, head to the link below and get your 3-month introductory plan today. Premium wireless that starts at $15 a month. Just click the link in the description below. As they walked deeper into the tunnel, one of the younger miners, a kid named Peter, who'd only been working in the mines for about 6 months, started talking nervously. He was asking Cobus about the rock formations and about how old these deposits were, partly to calm the kid down and partly because he actually found geology interesting. He started explaining. The rock they were walking through was pre-Cambrian, or what they suspect is nearly 3 billion years old. Of course, Peter laughed nervously and was like, 3 billion? There's no way. There's nothing that old. But Cobus explained that when the rock formed, there was no life on Earth. No animals, there was no plants, there was just really a lot of water, rock, and poisonous air. It was a completely different planet. And they continued walking, and then Cobus stopped abruptly, and Peter nearly walked into him. And he asked him, "What is it? Why did you stop? What's going on?" But Cobus didn't answer. He just quickly put his fingers to his lips, and he began listening intently. He had obviously heard something. It wasn't a sound that meant danger, but it was something else. It was a kind of noise. Even though it was very faint, it actually sounded like somebody had struck a bell deeper in the mine. So he turned to Peter and was like, "Do you hear that?" And again, everybody stopped and listened intently. And after a brief moment, Peter told him that he didn't hear anything. However, Cobus had. It was this faint metallic ringing, and it was coming from the rock wall directly to their left. Cobus moved his lamp closer to the wall, examining it very carefully. Now, the rock here where he was looking looked the same as everywhere else, right? Rough, grayish brown, scarred from blasting. It's just stone. But as he ran his hand over it, he felt something. There was a spot that was really smooth, like perfectly smooth. And it was actually about the size of a golf ball. And so Cobus turned to Peter and he's like, "Hand me a pick right now." So he handed Cobus a small picking hammer and he slowly began carefully chipping away at the rock around the very, very smooth spot. And of course, the other miners, they crowded around and their lamps all focused on the same area, and it created a bright circle of light in the otherwise pitch black tunnel. And as Cobus worked, more of the smooth surface was revealed. This smooth part of the stone was actually curved and it had a different color than the surrounding rock. It was darker and it almost kind of had this kind of metallic sheen to it. And all the other miners, when they saw it, began muttering to each other. They're like, "What is this? What could this possibly be?" They didn't know. But Cobus didn't have an answer either. He just kept chipping away, being very careful not to hit whatever this thing was directly. After about 10 or so minutes of careful work, he'd exposed enough to see what exactly they were looking at. And he held it in his hand and they all kind of looked at it and they marveled. They're like, "Wow." It was a sphere about the size of a cricket ball, perfectly round, and as far as they could tell, actually embedded in the stone like it had been there when the rock formed. A lot of them suspected that this couldn't have been possible because this rock that they were in was what they thought was around 2.8 billion years old. There was nothing on Earth that old that could make a sphere so perfect. Well, Cobus reached out and he touched it. The surface was incredibly smooth. It was almost like glassy. It was also cooler to the touch, cooler than the surrounding rock, which again, didn't make any sense. Because remember, they were 500 feet underground. Everything should be roughly the same temperature. Peter grew increasingly nervous at the sight of this, and he began stuttering and stammering. Should we take it out? What do we do with this? What is it? I don't have a good feeling. And, they all kind of sat and thought about it, and part of Cobus wanted to leave it alone. There was something really unsettling about finding something so obviously artificial in rock this old. But his curiosity won, and together they carefully chipped away more rock until the sphere was loose enough to remove. And so Cobus pulled it free and he held it in his hand, and they all kind of looked at it and they marveled. They're like, wow, it was a sphere about the size of a cricket ball. There were no seams, there were no rough spots or indication of how it was made, but there were these little grooves running around it. From what he could see, there were 3 parallel lines perfectly spaced circling the sphere like latitude lines on a globe. It was really heavy, much heavier than a rock that size should be. Cobus, turned it over in his hands and he was examining it from every angle, and he noticed something about this sphere that really creeped him out. Somehow, even though the sphere appeared solid, like there was something moving, like liquid or smoke or something swirling around in it. And all the men were taken aback by what they were looking at. Peter was frightened, obviously. Cobus was trying to calm him down and just told him it's just minerals or something, catching the light in a weird way. But even as he said it, he didn't really believe it, because the movement inside the sphere wasn't random. It had patterns, like it was responding to being held. Now they knew they needed to show this to somebody, and ASAP. So they marked the spot where they'd found it and headed back up to the surface, Cobus carrying the sphere carefully in his hands. It seemed to get heavier as they climbed, which didn't make any sense. And all of them, the entire time up, could still hear that ringing sound coming from the sphere. When they emerged into the sunlight, Cobus had to squint against the sun, and the grooves were so precise they could have been cut by a machine. What machine existed nearly 3 billion years ago? They brought the sphere to the mine's office, where the site supervisor, a man named Hendrik Pretorius, was doing paperwork. When Cobus set the sphere on his desk, Hendrik just stared at it. He was flabbergasted by this, and he started asking the 4 men, "Where did you find this?" Cobus explained that they were in section 7B, about 500 feet down and embedded in the rock. But not just any section of rock. Again, this was pre-Cambrian rock. Hendrik picked up the sphere, testing its weight, and his expression grew more confused the longer he held it. After several moments of not saying anything, he just said that this is simply too heavy to be pyrophyllite, and in fact, it was too heavy to be any rock that he knew of. I mean, even after holding it up to the light and, examining the grooves and the spaces very carefully, he really had no idea what it was, and knew that they needed to contact the University of Johannesburg to have geologists examine it further. I mean, they had no idea what they were dealing with. Dr. Francois Grobler from the University of Johannesburg arrived at the mine 3 days later. He was a thin, nervous man in his 50s who'd spent most of his career studying South African rock formations. When Hendrik showed him the sphere, his first reaction, of course, was to laugh. I mean, he was convinced they had brought him all the way out here just to play some stupid, elaborate joke. And, rightfully so, he got really irritated because he was convinced that this was clearly manufactured, and he's like, why would you pull me away from my work just to waste my time? But before he could finish his tangent, Cobus explained that no, this wasn't manufactured, at least by them, and they had actually found this embedded in the pre-Cambrian rock, and that he himself had dug it out. Obviously, Dr. Grobler wasn't sure what to think. He picked up the sphere and examined it closer with a magnifying glass, and the more he looked, the more puzzled he became. Now, he would have to show Francois exactly where he got this, and so, together, they descended back into the mine all the way to section 7B. Cobus pointed to the spot where he'd extracted the sphere, and Dr. Grobler examined the cavity in the rock, taking photographs and measurements, and he even took samples of the surrounding rock. Now, I need you to understand that for these two men and everybody at the time who was involved with this was completely flabbergasted. This didn't make any sense. The rock matrix itself showed no signs of intrusion, but they could see that this sphere was there when the rock had formed, what they believed was nearly 3 billion years ago. For them, that just couldn't happen. There was no way. And so as Dr. Grobler was examining the extraction site, his flashlight beam caught something else. There was another smooth spot in the rock only about 3 feet away from where the first sphere had been found, and another one, and another one. They extracted them carefully, although the next one was smaller, about the size of a marble, but otherwise identical. The same perfect spherical shape, the grooves, pretty much an exact twin. Or I guess you would call it a replica, not a twin, right? And after finding this, over the next few weeks, the mine conducted a systematic search. They found even more spheres, a whole lot more. And by the end of the month, they had extracted 127 from Section 7B alone. Now, they did range in size. You had everything from a few millimeters to about 10 centimeters in diameter. Some had 1 groove, some had 3, some didn't have any. But the underlying connection here is that they were all perfectly spherical. Not really sure what to make of this discovery, Dr. Grobler sent several spheres to various universities in the world for analysis. And what's interesting is when the results came back, not only were they confusing, but they were contradictory, right? So the University of Cape Town said that these were just natural concretions. Basically, mineral deposits had formed into spheres through geological processes over many, many years. But they couldn't explain the grooves or even the unusual weight. Now, a lab in Germany had analyzed the metal content and found an iron-nickel alloy with traces of iridium, which is a composition typically found in meteorites. But these weren't meteorites. These were found inside Earth rock. A Japanese research team claimed the spheres were radioactive. A British team said they weren't. An American lab said they were hollow. A Russian lab said they were solid. So, wait, what? It was like the spheres were different things to different instruments, or like they would somehow change properties. Meanwhile, Cobus had kept one of the spheres, actually the first one he'd found. Now, he told himself it was just a souvenir, maybe a conversation piece, but the truth was, he was so fascinated by it. He'd sit in his living room at night and he'd hold it and turn it over in his hands and, he'd watch that strange swirling movement inside. His wife, Marie, didn't like it. She would tell him over and over again to get rid of it, that it gave her the creeps and that it was obviously far from natural. But at one point, Marie pointed something out that he had tried not to think about. And she had told him, if it's not natural, then someone made it. Someone or something billions of years ago. What was here that long ago that could make something like that? Obviously, Cobus did not have an answer. In 1984, 11 years after Cobus first discovered the spheres, a man named Rolf Marx became the curator of the Museum of Dorp. The museum had acquired several dozen of the spheres, and Rolf made them the centerpiece of the collection. Now, by this time, Cobus had retired from mining, but he often visited the museum to see the spheres. He'd become an expert on them and, having found more than anyone else. And of course, he noticed things about them that weren't in any of these scientific reports. For instance, the spheres seemed to affect electronic equipment. Watches would run fast or slow when near them. Radios would pick up static. And once, when Cobus brought a compass near one of the larger spheres, the needle didn't just point toward it, it spun continuously, like the sphere itself was generating its own magnetic field. Now, Rolf Marx documented all of this, but when scientists came to study the spheres, they can never replicate these effects. It was like the spheres only did strange things when no one was officially observing them. One day, in 1987, Rolf called Cobus with urgent news. When he arrived at the museum, Rolf led him to the storage room where most of the spheres were kept, and he pointed to one of the display cases, and he asked him if he had noticed anything different, but Cobus didn't see it. Then he counted the spheres in the case. There were 15. The day before, there had been 14. Cobus was obviously confused and asked if somebody had donated one. Rolf told him no, and that he thought he simply miscounted. And so he showed Cobus a photograph from the previous week, clearly showing 14 in the case. The new sphere in the case is exactly identical to the other ones in every way. Cobus was clearly spooked by this because it entertained the idea that these spheres are somehow replicating. Now, obviously, they can't reproduce, but neither of them knew what was happening. It was far beyond their understanding. They decided to conduct a little experiment. They isolated one sphere, a small one with 3 grooves and a locked case by itself. They photographed it from every angle, measured it precisely, even weighed it on a sensitive scale. Then they sealed the case and put a camera on it to record continuously. A week later, there were 2 in the case. The camera footage showed nothing. When they analyzed it by frame, one frame there was 1 sphere, one frame over there were 2 spheres. Like the second one had simply manifested into existence over the course of a single frame. They tried the experiment again with different spheres. Sometimes nothing happened, sometimes a duplicate did appear, but there was really no pattern they could discern. Eventually, word of this did get out, and scientists from all over the world came to study the reproducing spheres. But whenever official studies were conducted, the spheres never duplicated. Imagine that. It only happened when no one was formally observing them. In 1995, Cobus, now in his late 60s, received an unexpected letter. It was from a professor in Costa Rica who had heard about the South African spheres. Now, the letter included photographs of massive stone spheres found in the Costa Rican jungle. And the Costa Rican spheres were huge. Some of these were over 2 meters in diameter. They were made of granite, not metal. And they were only about 1,400 years old, not 2.8 billion. But the precision was the same, right? The same spherical shape. And when Cobus looked closely at the photographs, he could see faint lines on some of them, all running parallel in groups of 3. So just like his spheres, there was obviously some sort of connection, right? It's very strange. Now, the professor, Dr. Eduardo Mendez, invited Cobus to Costa Rica to try and compare the spheres. Now, Cobus had never been out of South Africa, but this was way too intriguing to pass up. So when he arrived in Costa Rica and saw the giant spheres in person, he was struck by an overwhelming feeling of familiarity. They felt the same as his spheres, if that even makes any sense. Standing next to one of the large ones, he could feel that same subtle vibration, like there was this kind of faint ringing in his ears that he could hear. When he explained all this to Dr. Mendez, he came up with a theory. What if these aren't separate phenomena? What if cultures throughout history have been finding these spheres, the small metallic ones, and then creating these larger stone monuments to mark where they were found? Why would ancient peoples create massive stone copies of small metal spheres? What's the significance? What's the purpose? Well, Dr. Mendez showed Cobus a map, and he'd marked all the locations where stone spheres had been found. And not just in Costa Rica, but around the world. Bosnia, India, New Zealand, Easter Island, and of course, he'd marked the spot where the metallic spheres like Cobus's had been found. The locations overlapped. Well, not perfectly, but enough to be significant. And then when he pulled out another map and showed Cobus, things got pretty hairy. The map showed global magnetic anomalies, or places where the Earth's magnetic field was unusual. Now, the sphere's locations corresponded to many of these anomalies. Now, this meant that the spheres were somehow connected to the Earth's magnetic field. And the only thing they could possibly theorize was that these stones or orbs or spheres, whatever they are, were believed to be markers of some kind, potentially warning us about something. Dr. Mendez pulled out one more document. It was a seismic survey from a week earlier, and it showed unusual activity deep beneath the Earth's crust. He explained to Cobus that it was recorded directly below where the first sphere was found in South Africa. Now, Cobus studied the seismic data, and even though he didn't fully understand it, he could see the patterns. There were pulses, almost like a heartbeat, but they were coming from about 1,000 miles below the surface. Now, here's where it gets even more wild. There are indigenous legends that say that these spheres were placed by the gods to keep something imprisoned in the earth. If the spheres are removed or destroyed, well, we know what that means. Cobus returned to South Africa deeply troubled, and he thought about all the spheres that had been extracted from the mine, hundreds of them now, scattered in museums and in private collections around the world. I mean, if they really were some kind of containment system, what had they done by removing them? He went back to the museum of Dorp and found Rolf, and he told him about Costa Rica, all the magnetic anomalies and the seismic activity. Even though Rolf listened carefully, he then told Cobus something deeply troubling. He led Cobus to a locked room in the museum's basement. Inside was a single sphere, larger than any of the others, about the size of a football. It was covered in grooves, but not 3 or 4, but dozens. And it created this very intricate pattern. Cobus was shocked. Rolf explained to him that this one was found just last year at about 2,000 feet down. Apparently, the miners who found it both died the very next day. Heart attacks, actually, and they were both perfectly healthy in their 30s. There was something about this one that was different. Even from several feet away, he could feel some sort of static electricity, but it was very strong, kind of like a force field or something. You know how when you have magnets and you try to push them together and there's almost kind of like that field? That's kind of what it was. It was very strange, but you could definitely feel it. Rolf wanted to show him something, so he turned off the lights, and in the darkness, the sphere, it almost kind of glowed. The grooves on the surface seemed to be moving and shifting, almost forming new patterns. And so over the next few years, reports came in from around the world. The Costa Rican spheres were found to be slightly radioactive. I mean, not enough to be dangerous, but there was enough there that they could be detected. The Bosnian spheres were emitting low-frequency sound waves that could only be detected with special equipment. Spheres in New Zealand were affecting local wildlife. Birds wouldn't fly over them, fish avoided the waters near them, and the seismic activity beneath all the sphere sites was increasing. In 2003, Cobus, who's now very elderly, gave an interview to a documentary crew, and he talked about finding the first sphere, about the strange properties they exhibited, and just the entire connection between these strange spheres and the site. And at the very end, they had asked him what he thought the spheres were. And he went quiet for a moment, and then he said this verbatim: "I think Earth is not what we think it is. I think it's hollow, or at least partially hollow, and I think something lives down there. Something that's been down there since before life existed on the surface. The spheres, I think they're monitors, placed by something or someone to keep track of what's below. Or maybe they're restraints, keeping it contained. But we've been removing them, hundreds, maybe thousands of them over the years, all around the world. Now I think we're about to find out what they were protecting us from." Cobus Venter passed away in 2005 at the age of 77. The strange spheres in this story are known famously as the Clerk's Dorp spheres, and today they remain on display at the Museum of Dorp, where they continue to baffle scientists and visitors. Now, mainstream science tries to explain it away and say that these are nothing more than natural formations, concretions formed by the natural processes of mineral accumulation, and that even the grooves are just natural weathering patterns. And anything about duplication or, electromagnetic effects or even the glowing is it's ridiculous. It's just hoaxes, right? It's just measurement errors. But many of the miners who work in South African mines tell different stories. They explain that in recent years, they've been finding more, a lot more, and not just in South Africa, actually all over the world. And as a matter of fact, the significance of these mysterious stone spheres has been recognized globally. I mean, in June of 2014, they were added to the UNESCO's list of World Heritage Sites, acknowledging their cultural importance to not just Costa Rica, but to humanity as a whole. The ultimate purpose of the Clerk's Dorp spheres remains a mystery.